In addition to working in civic ecology, I also work in the area of environmental education. And these two interests come together when I look at how education and learning occurs when people participate in civic ecology practices. So young people and adults who participate in civic ecology practices learn about science and about their environment and about their community. But under certain conditions, they also learn about what's working and what's not working, or how effective their practices are in providing ecosystem services and other public goods. And here's where collaboration with scientists comes in. Research by my PhD student, Phil Silva, in New York City, shows that most civic ecology practices do not actually collaborate with scientists, so they're not monitoring their outcomes. But this isn't due to lack of interest. It's rather due to lack of resources and lack of time. And those practices that actually do collaborate with scientists tend to be the larger organizations, or maybe smaller organizations that are part of larger networks, like the Chicago Wilderness or the Bronx River Alliance. So today I'm going to use the example of the Bronx River Alliance to talk about how collaboration with scientists enables civic ecology practices to be more effective and have larger impacts. So the Bronx River, like most rivers in the United States, had a bunch of dams built along it. And in the Bronx, those dams started being built in the 1800s. But the problem was that the fish couldn't get around the dams to migrate. So most fish that migrate, like alewife, which is a kind of herring that used to be very abundant in the Bronx River, they migrate upstream as adults, and then they lay their eggs, and then they die or they complete their life cycle. But there's a very interesting exception to this rule, and that's the American eel. And American eels, which also actually used to be very abundant in the Bronx River, they actually enter the river as tiny little immature eels, and then they swim up the river, and they mature, they become adults actually in the river, and then they have to swim back down, and they reproduce actually in the open ocean. So part of the restoration efforts of the Bronx River was to construct fish ladders so that these fish could get around the dams. The scientists really didn't know what kind of fish ladders had the best design to enable these fish, the alewife or the eels, to actually swim up and around the dams. George Jackman is a former New York City police detective, but he retired from the police force to become a scientist. And one of the things that he does as a scientist is he scales the dams and the waterfalls along the Bronx River to find out if the fish, those alewife and the eels, can also scale these dams and swim up to the upper stretches of the Bronx River. And one way that he determines whether the fish are able to get around these dams is that he does something that's called electro fishing. And what this involves is they actually put a current into the water, and it shocks the fish, and the fish kind of turn belly up. And then they can collect the fish in these nets, and then they can count the number of fish before the fish recover from their shock and they can swim off. So one day when Jackman was out there electroshocking the fish, along with his fellow scientists and citizen scientists, he looked down and he actually spotted a handgun in the river. And Jackman was able to hand over the gun to the police, and the police used that evidence to track the suspect in a shooting that had taken place a couple of weeks before. So the suspect presumably had simply tossed that gun into the river, thinking that he was going to hide the evidence, little suspecting that Jackman would be out there electroshocking these fish. So Jackman was not only to help solve the crime, but his research is also being used to help solve another problem, and that is the best design for fish ladders. So we can learn through Jackman's research, and also we can adapt the practices or the designs of how we build these fish ladders. And we call this process adaptive management. So you can think of it kind of as a loop. You start out with a civic ecology practice, and then together with scientists, we monitor the outcomes of those processes, and then we use the results of the monitoring to adapt or improve the practices based on the results. Adaptive management in civic ecology practices involves collaboration. And this collaboration can be among scientists like Jackman, as well as scientific organizations like the Wildlife Conservation Society, and community groups like Rocking the Boat. So one thing that this community group, Rocking the Boat, has done, and it's also part of this collaboration, it's part of this project to restore the American eel, is they constructed these artificial mops. They're called eel mops. And the baby eel that are entering the river, they'll actually use these strands of this mop as substrate, so they'll cling on to the strands of the mop. And so the young people at Rocking the Boat at this community organization, they put the mops in the river, and then they can pull them out, and they can count the eels to see if the eels are, in fact, actually re-entering the river. And this kind of collaboration can grow. So a lot more organizations are involved, and this is both the community organizations as well as the scientific organizations. And then you can have more monitoring practices. So for example, in addition to the American Eel Project, you might have monitoring of different kinds of oyster reefs to determine their success in providing a substrate or a habitat for oysters. And we can think of this collaboration as another kind of loop. So this loop starts again with a civic ecology practice, and then you have connections formed with other organizations, and eventually you have new organizational partners. And we can put these two loops together. So on one hand, you have the learning or the adaptation loop, and on the other hand, you have the collaboration loop. And when you put them together, you have a practice that's called adaptive collaborative management or adaptive co-management. So one of the things that these groups in the Bronx wanted to do is they wanted to celebrate their achievements. And they put on an event that was called A Day in the Life of the Bronx River. And this is how the event worked. Community members, anybody that wanted to participate, they could start off in the upstream stretches of the river, and they would float down in a canoe. And as they floated down the river, they passed teams of professional and citizen scientists who were demonstrating their research. And I kind of wish I could have been there in that canoe on that day to celebrate the life of the river. But since I wasn't there, and I'm assuming most of you weren't there, or maybe none of you were there either, what we can do is read a little excerpt from the press release about the event. And I hope you'll see in this press release the components of adaptation and collaboration, or adaptive co-management in the Bronx River watershed. So the press release starts out, New York City Parks today joined the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Estuary Program, the Bronx River Alliance, and representatives from federal, state, city, university, and community organizations who are conducting a wide range of research projects along the Bronx River. So you can see what you have here is the collaboration amongst a bunch of stewardship and scientific groups. And the press release continues. These monitoring efforts are expanding our knowledge of the health of the river, while helping government agencies and the public make decisions about water quality improvements, habitat restoration, and recreational use of this important urban waterway. So here you can have the learning and the adaptation loop, or the second kind of process that transpires in adaptive co-management. So this notion of adaptive co-management, learning through collecting data on outcomes and adapting processes or practices accordingly, as well as collaboration among scientists, citizens groups, and government, is one lens through which we can understand how individual civic ecology practices can improve their effectiveness and expand their impacts.